Okay, so now that you've seen Reagan's challenger speech, let's walk through the degree to which we feel like it addresses all of those parameters of the rhetorical situation. So let's start with context. How is Reagan addressing both the narrow and the broader context of the moment? Well, first of all, we can see that he directly addresses what has just happened, right? Rather than ignoring it or maybe minimizing it. In fact, he starts out his speech by talking about how he had planned something else, but in fact changed his plans in response to the explosion. He says, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union, but the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. So, if we're going to use some more rhetorical terminology here, we might call this kairos or timeliness. So, he's directly responding to the situation, the events of that particular moment. And we can think about how the speech might have had a very different response if he'd continued on with those original plans and given the State of the Union as originally intended. So look at this, right? So here's Reagan delivering a State of the Union during another year, and how that would have differently set a tone, differently engaged the audience than how he ended up addressing the audience and giving this speech. Not in a typical State of the Union situation, but in the Oval Office, right, creating a much more intimate feel. We really are centered on him and our relationship as the audience with him. And again, seeing him in a much more kind of domestic situation than we would in this much more sort of official and kind of formal situation of the State of the Union. So in these ways, right, we see him directly, again, shifting not only what he's going to say, but how he's going to say it to match that context. And now he doesn't only speak directly to the events of the Challenger explosion, he also alludes a bit more obscurely to the larger socio-political context. And by that I mean the Cold War. Right, so this is 1986. So this is really kind of at the height of the rivalry between the US and the USSR in control kind of for the world stage. And again, while he doesn't directly use the words Cold War or talk about the USSR, he says this. He says, we don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. Now, again, what he's talking about here is he's trying to draw a comparison between the US, right, being transparent, right, allowing the public to see their mistakes or their failures, and what he's suggesting or alluding to in terms of what the USSR might do in terms of covering up any mistakes that the government has made. So he's kind of in a way trying to flip the situation, suggesting that because you, the audience, the public know about this, this actually is evidence of America's transparency, of the superiority of the American way of life and the approach of the American government. So in this way, again, we see him addressing both the specific, concrete, immediate situation and this more general political situation. So let's talk about him as a speaker. So as you watch Reagan, as you listen to Reagan, as you hear what he's saying, but also pay attention to how he's delivering his words, again, what kind of sense do you get of him as a person, as a persona? One thing we might notice is how he begins his speech by saying, Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the shuttle Challenger. Now, why is he doing this? And what effect does it have? Well, one thing we can see is that it immediately draws our attention to Reagan not only as an authority figure, not only as president, but also as a husband, right? Because he's referring to Nancy Reagan, his wife, and the First Lady. So we think of him as part of a family, perhaps even as a father figure. And we can see that reinforced not only by that comment, but also again by the setting. Not only is he in the Oval Office, again, a more intimate setting, a more domestic setting, but we can see these family photos that are arrayed around him, again, reinforcing or drawing attention to his role as a family man, as a father. We can also pay attention not only, again, to what he says or where he's saying it, but to how he's delivering his lines. We can see from his facial expression here that he's really trying to project an aura of care and concern. Yes, he's strong. Yes, he's the president, but he also is empathetic. He's also compassionate. He also, again, feels pained to the core, right, by this tragedy. Now, again, we should acknowledge that Reagan himself didn't write this speech. He had a speechwriter, a very famous speechwriter, Peggy Noonan. So he's delivering the lines written by another person, but Reagan was also an actor, so we can really see his acting skills coming to the fore. Not to say that he wasn't also genuinely upset by this event, but the way that he's delivering these lines, again, with authenticity, with sort of deep feeling, feels like it's also drawing on his legacy as an actor. Now let's think about the audience. How is he speaking to his audience? Well, one thing that kind of jumps to attention immediately is his use of we. We is used an incredible amount of times in this speech, maybe 10, 15 times. I should go through again and count the number of we's. But just in enumerating a few of those instances, we can see he says, we lost, we mourn, we've forgotten, we've grown used to, will continue. So through this use of we, he's really trying to, again, draw on and reinforce this sense of collective identity. Not just any kind of collective identity, but the audience's sense of collective identity as Americans. And we know that he's particularly drawing on this sense of national identity or patriotic identity through the particular values that he brings to the fore and that he associates with the astronauts who died. He talks about their bravery, he talks about their courage, again, very traditional American values. And we can also see that with his references, the sort of stories that he tells or the American myths that he calls on. One is that of Americans as pioneers, right? Going back to this sort of American mythos of us as a pioneering people, and saying we're still pioneers. Not only is he referencing pioneers, but also explorers. The whole last part of the speech is really focused on this idea of Sir Francis Drake, kind of memorial to Drake and how Drake's legacy of exploration has been kind of continued to be carried out by the astronauts and by the American people more generally. And we can still see that this is really helping him, again, frame the exigence or what the problem is. He says that all of this, right, this disaster, this tragedy, is all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. Right, so here then we can see him kind of framing the exigence or the problem as a sort of roadblock on the path to exploration, the path to discovery. So finally, what's his purpose? Well, it's to get the American people to accept this tragedy as the cost of exploration. And ultimately, to get the American people, therefore, to continue to support NASA, to support the space program, to support him as president, right, rather than losing confidence in his leadership, right, and ultimately to continue to boost the morale of America, right, during this kind of period of quote-unquote existential conflict between the American way of life, right, and the Soviet way of life. So all in all, do we think it's effective? Well, certainly at the time, both Republicans and Democrats responded really positively to the president's speech. So Tip O'Neill, who was the Democratic Speaker of the House at the time, right, the opposite party of Reagan, even he in his memoirs talked about how powerful this speech was. He said it was a trying day for all Americans, and Ronald Reagan spoke to our highest ideals. So, really, from the response at the time, it seemed like that speech was very effective in terms of how it fit the parameters of the rhetorical situation. So it seems like maybe Bitzer was right? So Lloyd Bitzer, author of The Rhetorical Situation, said that the key determinant of the success of a speech is whether or not it fits the situation. And it seems like Reagan's speech is proof, right, or evidence that Bitzer's claim is correct, or his way of assessing speeches is correct. But is that true? We can bring another way of looking at the situation to bear on this as well. So Richard Vatz, just a few years after Lloyd Bitzer writes his The Rhetorical Situation, challenges Bitzer. And so he writes a very famous article, or an article that becomes very famous, called The Myth of the Rhetorical Situation. And he publishes in that same academic journal article, but a few years later in 1973. And again, Vatz directly challenges Bitzer. And he says, no, rhetoric is not a response to the situation. Rhetoric shapes the situation. How does it do that? Well, by drawing our attention to some aspects of the situation and away from others. He said it's all about salience. One way to think about that is through thinking about this very famous optical illusion, right? What is it? Is it a rabbit or is it a duck? Now you can see kind of like both of those things kind of simultaneously exist. We can see it as a rabbit or we can see it as a duck. But once somebody starts talking about it as a duck or as a rabbit, you're going to see those characteristics much more emphasized, right? You're much more likely to see this image as either a rabbit or a duck, depending on how it's presented to you, right? How it's framed. And this is how rhetoric works as well, or this is how Vatz argued that rhetoric works, right? It makes some parts of the situation clearer, more present to us, and therefore shapes our perception of reality. And this is just another way of saying what the textbook that you read for Monday said, which is that rhetoric is constitutive. It doesn't just reflect reality, it actually shapes our perceptions of it. And we can see Reagan's speech also as evidence of Vatz's perspective, right? Because Reagan really reshaped the American public's understanding of the situation. He made the public see this not as a crisis, right? Something for which the government or NASA should be held accountable, but rather a tragedy. Again, this kind of bump in the road, this natural consequence of a process of discovery and exploration. So who's right? Is Bitzer right that rhetoric responds to the situation? Or is Vatz right that rhetoric really shapes our perception of the situation? This is a question that we're going to ask you to explore as you start your own analysis of speeches and as you begin to speak yourself.